Hi, I'm Kaya Allo, and welcome to Ink and Spine, a space between words and sound, where each week we sit together with a book, a film, or an album, savoring each at the sweet pace of honey. Let's begin. Thank you to those that have subscribed and supported the podcast thus far. It means the world. I invite you to subscribe and follow if you haven't already, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts and wherever you connect with others online. Thanks in advance. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to make a small but humble revision. I'd initially planned to take 2 episodes in exploring this book, Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. But I've been humbled as I am learning a million things with every episode, that the whole premise of this podcast that nobody asked for is to savor slowly at the pace of honey. And rushing and condensing was going against that ethos. So I am expanding this exploration to 4 episodes instead of just 2. So we'll be exploring this for the month of July. I hope that expansion of space creates an even bigger invitation for you to find your own resonance and sweetness. More space. At the Presidential Center grand opening on Juneteenth of this year, Barack Obama included this in his remarks. I dare you to do better. I dare you to dream bigger. I don't know about you, but I watched that like the nerd I was in 2008 in high school, rushing home for AC 360 on CNN to watch this historic campaign. For me, it was particularly exciting because I had never witnessed history with such consciousness before. Like, not that I was some enlightened being, no, but I was at an age where I'd never experienced history with this much awareness. There's nothing like this story. Like, when I was thinking about this book, reading it again, it is insane that in all of American history, he is the only one to have done this. And he's still living. I want to make sure that in this exploration, I don't litter it with too many of my words, because Barack has enough eloquence to best articulate his story. I love how the introduction begins. He says, "It is to my family, though my mother, my grandparents, my siblings stretched across oceans and continents, that I owe the deepest gratitude and to whom I dedicate this book. Without their constant love and support, without their willingness to let me sing their song, and their tolerance of the occasional wrong note, I could never have hoped to finish. If nothing else, I hope that the love and respect I feel for them shines through on every page." That's on page 6. I feel like gratitude is the resounding word that you can probably find on almost every page of this book. And even in so many of Barack and Michelle's speeches, gratitude, gratitude, gratitude remains such a focal point. And I'm just really grateful for those reminders. Gratitude. As he continues in his introduction, he does something that is so necessary, and I didn't notice it before. And that is almost a caution sign that his singular experience is a drop in the ocean of the experience of not just Black people or men or people of mixed race or ethnicity, but rather that we all are similar in that we are just one drop in a giant ass ocean. And that his experience, though beautiful and so universally resonant, is not the Black experience. He writes, "At some point then, in spite of a stubborn desire to protect myself from scrutiny, in spite of the periodic impulse to abandon the entire project, what has found its way onto these pages is a record of a personal, interior journey. a boy's search for his father, and through that search, a workable meaning for his life as a Black American. He later says on page 6, finally, there are the dangers inherent in any autobiographical work. The temptation to color events in ways favorable to the writer. The tendency to overestimate the interest in one's experience. Selective lapses of memory. Such hazards are only magnified when the writer lacks the wisdom of age. The distance can cure one of certain vanities. An autobiography promises feats worthy of record, conversations with famous people, a central role in important events. There is none of that here. At the very least, an autobiography implies a summing up, a certain closure that hardly suits someone of my years, still busy charting his way through the world. I can't even hold up my experience as being somehow representative of the Black American experience. Whatever the label that attaches to this book, autobiography, memoir, family history, or something else, what I've tried to do is write an honest account of a particular province of my life. And that's on page 6. That level of honesty and matter-of-factness about his humanity, the strengths and the failings, are what drew me to the book back in 2008 and what draws me to the book now. I'd never heard that phrase, a province of one's life. Like in Canada, I think about provinces and landforms and lines drawn in legalities and on maps, but to think about a person's life as provinces is so interesting to me. We're introduced to the band, the gang. We've got Anne, who is Barack's mother. We're introduced to Toot, Barack's grandmother, and Barack's grandfather, Gramps. As we move into chapter 1, I'm so grateful for the rest of this exploration to spend as much time in Barack's words than my own attempts at interpretation. This is a man who truly knows how to use language to universalize a message. In chapter 1, he articulates something that I feel like most of us can relate to in 2026. And I think of this as sort of a space age of dreams. And he sharing a few beers with my father, Gramps might listen to his new son-in-law sounding off about politics or the economy, about far-off places like Whitehall or the Kremlin, and imagine himself seeing into the future. He would begin to read the newspaper more carefully, finding early reports of America's newfound integrationist creed, and decide in his mind that the world was shrinking, sympathies changing, that the family from Wichita had in fact moved to the forefront of Kennedy's new frontier and Dr. King's magnificent dream. How could America send men into space and still keep its Black citizens in bondage? One of my earliest memories is the sitting on my grandfather's shoulders as the astronauts from one of the Apollo missions arrived at Hickam Air Force Base after a successful splashdown. I remember the astronauts, in aviator glasses, as being far away, barely visible through the portal of an isolation chamber. But Gramps would always swear that one of the astronauts waved just at me, and I waved back. It was the part of the story he had told himself. With his Black son-in-law and his brown grandson, Gramps had entered the space age. And that was on page 17. Reading this reminded me of the Artemis II mission. For those number of days, especially the days when the astronauts were getting close to their approach and encounter with another feat of human history, like their eyes have set upon something that only the 4 of them have actually ever seen with their own eyes. We are reliant on technology and their interpretation of this part of space that only 4 people have actually seen. I wondered if, for those few days, the irony of timing, and it might not even be irony, that it was Easter and the end of Ramadan and all of the celebrations in so many different religions, their message seemed to be so focused and intentional to try to call this energy back, not just for themselves, but for anyone around the world who was witnessing their incredible feat. Continuing with chapter 1, there's a passage that I feel gives the largest hint to the title of the book, Dreams from My Father. And that's on page 19 when Barack writes, "I would not have known at the time, for I was too young to realize that I was supposed to have a live-in father, just as I was too young to know that I needed a race. For an improbably short span, it seems that my father fell under the same spell as my mother and her parents. And for the first 6 years of my life, even as that spell was broken and the worlds that they thought they'd left behind reclaimed, each of them, I occupied the place where their dreams had been." And that on page 19 felt like the promise of every new generation. Like, aren't we the ones that exist in that place, that space of dreams between our forebears and what comes after? In the time between Barack Sr.'s departure back to Kenya and Barack Jr. in his adjusted life with Anne and Gramps and Toots, his mother meets a man named Lolo who is from Indonesia. And in chapter 2, we get a small glimpse into what that adjustment must have been like, not only for Barack, but in this beautiful interpretation of being witnessed through the eyes of another. Like, we get to have his memories articulated with this wisdom of age, of what his mother must have experienced or what Lolo must have experienced. I thought for a moment, why was the man killed? The one you saw? Because he was weak. That's all? Lolo shrugged and rolled his pant leg back down. That's usually enough. Men take advantage of weakness in other men. They're just like countries in that way. The strong man takes the weak man's land. He makes the weak man work in his fields. If the weak man's woman is pretty, the strong man will take her." He paused to take another sip of water, then said, "Which would you rather be?" I didn't answer, and Lolo squinted up at the sky. "Better to be strong," he finally said, rising to his feet. "If you can't be strong, be clever and make peace with someone who's strong. But always better to be strong yourself. Always." My mother watched us from inside the house, propped up at her desk grading papers. What are they talking about? She wondered to herself. Blood and guts, probably. Swallowing nails. Cheerful, manly things. She really was grateful for Lolo's solicitude toward me. He wouldn't have treated his own son very differently. She knew that she was lucky for Lolo's basic kindness. She tried to picture herself on the day of our arrival. A mother of 24 with a child in tow, married to a man whose history, whose country she barely knew. She had known so little then. She realized now her innocence carried right along with her American passport. Things could have turned out worse. Much worse. And that's on page 26. I can't help but acknowledge what is happening in the greater world around us. And I'll talk about this later on in the episode, but it's interesting to think about the ways that we think about culture and belonging in maybe these rigid forms that don't account for these other languages of belonging, that they're only languages that can come from being in a specific place and smelling the air, eating the food, engaging with the people. I appreciate the honesty of Barack's interpretation of what his mother's experience might have been. Later on the page, she writes, she had experienced it to be difficult, this new life of hers. Before leaving Hawaii, she had tried to learn all she could about Indonesia. First the Dutch for over 3 centuries, then the Japanese during the war, seeking control over vast stores of oil, metal, and timber. The fight for independence after the war and the emergence of a freedom fighter named Sukarno as the country's first president. A poor country, underdeveloped, utterly foreign. This much she had known. She was prepared for the dysentery and fevers, the cold water baths and having to squat over a hole, the electricities going out every few weeks, the heat and endless mosquitoes. Nothing more than inconveniences, really. And she was tougher than she looked, tougher than even she had known herself to be. And anyway, that was part of what drew her to Lolo after Barack left. The promise of something new and important, helping her husband rebuild a country in a charged and challenging place beyond her parents' reach. There's a unique way that Barack Jr. mixes this adult awareness that has come with age, wisdom, and then reflection with his own boyish observation. The way he observes and remembers his interactions with Lolo are so powerful to me. Revisiting the book, a little bit older, makes these portions of Barack's life so much more resonant for me, especially in the ways that he can articulate his young witnessing, but then meet that with his wisdom of age and reflection at this particular time. There's a passage in chapter 2 where Barack is noticing how Lolo is responding so differently to power than before. Power. The word fixed in my mother's mind like a curse. In America, it had generally remained hidden from view until you dug beneath the surface of things. Until you visited an Indian reserve or spoke to a Black person whose trust you'd earned. But here, power was undisguised, indiscriminate, naked, always fresh in the memory. Power had taken Lolo and yanked him back into line just when he thought he'd escaped, making him feel its weight, letting him know that his life wasn't his own. That's how things were. You couldn't change it. You could just live by the rules. So simple once you learned them. And so, Lolo had made his peace with power, learned the wisdom of forgetting, just as his brother-in-law had done, making millions as a high official in the National Oil Company, just as another brother had tried to do. Only he had miscalculated and was now reduced to stealing pieces of silverware whenever he came for a visit, selling them later for a loose cigarette. I'm curious if this is one of the many seeds planted to cultivate what would become Barack's personal philosophy, his political philosophy, and who he is today. Like in witnessing Lolo and then Lolo's brother-in-law and Lolo's other brother, all these different calculations and choices of how to either make peace with power or to fight against it. I'm curious if this is where he was finding what his unique balance would become. When I go back a page, I think about what Barack had wrote of his observation through his mother's eyes of the change in Lolo from when he met and in Hawaii versus the Lolo that now appeared in Indonesia. He writes, he didn't talk that way anymore. In fact, it seemed as though he barely spoke to her at all. Only out of necessity or when spoken to, and even then only of the task at hand. Repairing a leak or planning a trip to visit some distant cousin. It was as if he had been pulled into some dark, hidden place, out of reach, taking with him the brightest part of himself. On some nights, she, meaning Anne, would hear him up after everyone else had gone to bed, wandering through the house with a bottle of imported whiskey, nursing his secrets. Other nights, he would tuck a pistol under his pillow before falling off to sleep. Whenever she asked him what was wrong, he would gently rebuff her, saying that he was just tired. It was as if he had come to mistrust words somehow. Words and the sentiment that words carried. I find it interesting that soon after this passage in the book, we find out that Lolo passes away from a liver ailment at the young age of 51. There's a passage toward the end of chapter 2 where Barack beautifully articulates the sweet, endearing nature of Anne, his mother, as she tries to better understand this whole other half of her own son. But in that novel and well-intentioned pursuit of understanding, there is this risk of homogeny, of tokenism that can appear. There's a pressure on both sides. And on page 30 and 31, we read, her message came to embrace Black people generally. She would come home with books on the civil rights movement. To be Black was to be the beneficiary of a great inheritance, a special destiny, glorious burdens that only we were strong enough to bear. Burdens we were to carry with style. More than once, my mother would point out, Harry Belafonte is the best-looking man on the planet. It was in this context that I came across the picture in Life magazine of the Black man who had tried to peel off his skin. I imagine other Black children, then and now, undergoing similar moments of revelation. Perhaps it comes sooner for most. The parents' warning not to cross the boundaries of a particular neighborhood, or the frustration of not having hair like Barbie no matter how long you tease and comb, or the tale of a father's or grandfather's humiliation at the hands of an employer or a cop, overheard while you're supposed to be asleep. Maybe it's easier for a child to receive the bad news in small doses, allowing for a system of defenses to build up, although I suspect I was one of the luckier ones, having been given a stretch of childhood free from self-doubt. I'd love to hear how this passage on page 30 and 31 resonates with you and for you. I think that this story goes beyond any one ethnicity or culture. I think this experience is very universal, whether it be language or place or climate. But the notion that because of this blissful unawareness of his mother, Anne, Barack was able to be equipped with the tools that were unencumbered and uncontaminated by the reality of the racialized lived experience. And I wonder if that is what contributes to him as more of a humanist than a person that aligns themselves with one group over another. I'm struck by the sweetness of his mother, Anne. That endearing effort to try to not just herself understand this other half of her son that was outside of her experience as a white woman, but also to help her son understand this part of himself. We continue with chapter 3, and in this segment or province of the book that we're exploring in today's episode, I would say that this is the most consequential of the 5 chapters we explore, from the introduction all the way to chapter 4. And chapter 3 is consequential because it is jam-packed. So much is happening in little Barack's life. In previous chapters, we become aware of his origin in Hawaii, his father leaving to go back to Kenya and eventually beginning another family there. And in that time, his mother marries a man named Lolo from Indonesia. Barack and his mother moved to Indonesia, where later his sister Maya is born, and he gives us a glimpse into what life is like in this brand new culture, fully immersed. But after his time in Indonesia, Barack moves back to Hawaii as a young boy still to move in with his grandparents, Gramps and Toot. And we get to experience Barack witness the evolution of time through the bodies of his grandparents, physiologically and psychologically. On a physical level, they have downsized drastically from the sprawling house of his origin to a small apartment, and they're older. They're a lot older. Additionally, he notices the frustration of Gramps as Gramps is stagnated and trying to find a new identity for himself as he struggles with work as an insurance agent. On the other hand, Toot has seemed to take a small page from Lolo's wisdom to better navigate power and to remain strong, and she has worked her way up at the bank. Toots is a Renaissance woman. She wakes up early, she curls her hair, she puts on a little heel. And on the other hand, Gramps is struggling with his identity, not able to provide the way Toots now provides for the family. In chapter 3, Barack writes, Toot didn't complain. Every morning she woke up at 5 a.m. and changed from the frowsy muumuus she wore around the house into a tailored suit and high-heeled pumps. Her face powdered, her hips girdled, her thinning hair bolstered. She would board the 6:30 bus to arrive at her downtown office before anyone else. From time to time, she would admit a grudging pride in her work and took pleasure in telling us the inside story behind the local finance news. When I got older, she would confide in me that she had never stopped dreaming of a house with a white picket fence, days spent baking or playing bridge or volunteering at the local library. I was surprised by this admission, for she rarely mentioned hopes or regrets. It may or may not have been true that she would have preferred the alternative history she imagined for herself. But I came to understand that her career spanned a time when the work of a wife outside the home was nothing to brag about. For her, or for Gramps, that it represented only lost years, broken promises. What Toot believed kept her going were the needs of her grandchildren and the stoicism of her ancestors. As Barack is getting to know his Gramps and Toot differently in chapter 3, he also is getting to know himself in the context of other kids differently. When I think of belonging, there's a passage on page 36 that reads, "There was one other child in my class, though, who reminded me of a different sort of pain. Her name was Coretta." I don't want to, pull at little strings, but this is so crazy that of all the little girls he would have a memorable encounter with, that the little girl would be named Coretta. And then decades and decades later, he would become Barack Obama. I'm just tripping y'all. But anyway, let's continue. Her name was Coretta, and before my arrival, she had been the only Black person in our grade. She was plump and dark and didn't seem to have many friends. From the first day, we avoided each other, but watched from a distance as if direct contact would only remind us more keenly of our isolation. I paused there because if I could have had this passage when I started school, most oftentimes it was just me, and I did not see any reflections, not in the staff, not in the students. This was helpful. Continuing, finally, during recess one hot, cloudless day, we found ourselves occupying the same corner of the playground. I don't remember what we said to each other, but I remember that suddenly she was chasing me around the jungle gyms and swings. She was laughing brightly, and I teased her and dodged this way and that, until she finally caught me and we fell on the ground, breathless. When I looked up, I saw a group of children, faceless before the glare of the sun, pointing down at us. Coretta has a boyfriend. The chants grew louder as a few more kids circled us. She's not my girlfriend, I stammered. I looked to Coretta for some assistance, but she just stood there, looking down at the ground. I shouted, and I ran up to Coretta and gave her a slight shove. She staggered back and looked up at me, but still said nothing. "Leave me alone," I shouted again. And suddenly Coretta was running, faster and faster until she disappeared from sight. Appreciative laughs rose around me. Then the bell rang, and the teachers appeared to round us back into class. For the rest of the afternoon, I was haunted by the look on Coretta's face just before she had started to run. Her disappointment and the accusation. I wanted to explain to her somehow that it had been nothing personal. I just never had a girlfriend before and saw no particular need to have one now. But I didn't even know if that was true. I knew only that it was too late for explanations, that somehow I'd been tested and found wanting. And whenever I snuck a glance at Coretta's desk, I would see her with her head bent down over her work, appearing as if nothing had happened, pulled into herself and asking no favors. My act of betrayal brought me some room from the other kids, and like Coretta, I was mostly left alone. I made a few friends, learned to speak less often in class, and managed to toss a wobbly football around. But from that day forward, a part of me felt trampled on, crushed, and I took refuge in the life that my grandparents led. Reading this passage made me curious of Coretta's experience first, then, and now, if she still remembers it and how she remembers it, and also the other kids that surrounded this instance on the playground. I wonder what it meant for them as people and how it influenced the world that they live in now. Later on, we learn about Barack's coping and the almost off-ramp that half of his identity offers him in a way that Coretta doesn't have the same way to escape the experience. At 10 o'clock, I went to my room. Johnny Carson came on at that time, and there was no negotiating around that. And I would fall asleep to the sound of top 40 music on the radio. Nested in the soft, forgiving bosom of America's consumer culture, I felt safe. It was as if I had dropped into a long hibernation. I wonder sometimes how long I might have stayed there had it not been for the telegram Toot found in the mailbox one day. "Your father's coming to see you," she said. "Next month. 2 weeks after your mother gets here." I think there's a particular brand of stoicism that can only come from spending a significant time with an elder like a grandparent. I resonate so deeply with this part of his story because I too was raised by my grandparents. They are the reason of so much of what makes me what I am. My grandmother in particular, I'm reminded of her when I read the lines of Toot, the descriptions of her waking up early and going to the bank. And though my grandmother was not literate, that did not stop her from moving mountains. She was so tough and so firm, and the parts of Toot that Barack seems to admire in the book are the same parts in my own grandmother that I admire. And I'm curious if you have a similar experience, whether with a grandparent or an elder. I'd love to know if there's any parts of your elders that seem to have stuck to you today. We close off chapter 3 with these beautiful descriptions of a boy meeting his father, who is now a stranger. And on page 39, we read, "I watched him carefully as the adults began to talk. He," meaning Barack Sr., "was much thinner than I'd expected, the bones of his knees cutting the legs of his trousers in sharp angles. I couldn't imagine him lifting anyone off the ground. Beside him, a cane with a blunt ivory head leaned against the wall. He wore a blue blazer and a white shirt, and a scarlet ascot. His horn-rimmed glasses reflected the light of the lamp so that I couldn't see his eyes very well. But when he took the glasses off to rub the bridge of his nose, I saw that they were slightly yellow, the eyes of someone who's had malaria more than once. There was a fragility about his frame, a caution when he lit a cigarette or reached for his beer. That description is so familiar of my upbringing. Like you're observing this figure and you are just taking them in as a little person, but without maybe the tact of an adult to be subtle. A month is not enough time to become reacquainted with anyone, let alone a parent. Barack writes so beautifully on page 39, there was so much to tell in that single month, so much explaining to do. And yet, when I reach back into my memory for the words of my father, the small interactions or conversations we might have had, they seem irretrievably lost. Perhaps they are imprinted too deeply. His voice the seed of all sorts of tangled arguments that I carry on with myself, as impenetrable now as the pattern of my genes, so that all I could perceive is the worn-out shell. My wife offers a simpler explanation, that boys and their fathers don't always have much to say to each other unless and until they trust. And this may come closer to the mark, for I often felt mute before him, and he never pushed me to speak. I'm left with mostly images that appear and die off in my mind like distant sounds. His head thrown back in laughter at one of Graham's jokes, as my mother and I hang Christmas ornaments. His grip on my shoulder as he introduces me to one of his old friends from college. The narrowing of his eyes, the stroking of his sparse goatee as he reads his important books. Later on page 42, Barack writes, he, meaning his father, remains opaque to me, a present mass. When I mimic his gestures or turns of phrase, I know neither their origins nor their consequences. Can't see how they play out over time. But I grow accustomed to his company. We round off our exploration of the book in chapter 4 for today. And if you haven't done so already, I invite you to grab the book from your local library, your local bookstore. And if none of those options are available, I'll make sure to include a link where you can order the book on Amazon Prime. Additionally, I would say that this is a great audiobook listen because Barack reads it in his Barack voice. We round off our exploration of the book with chapter 4. And chapter 4 is another helpful glimpse and articulation of discovering identity, but through the context of television and music and media. I feel so universally connected to this part of the book because I think this is the immigrant experience. I was recently listening to an interview that Anastasia Soare of Anastasia Beverly Hills, and she was describing her origin story and coming to America from Europe and not speaking English, but how she learned English by watching Oprah. And it was wild that as she's saying this, Oprah is sitting in the audience. All these years later, now a friend of Anastasia. I too was able to develop my way of speaking because of Oprah. I came to Canada speaking English, but I had a hybrid accent between a Zimbabwean, South African, and British accent. And that was not going to fly on the playground when I arrived. And so I remember coming home from school and I would watch Oprah every day at 3:30. And I learned how to change the way I said certain words. So instead of what's up, I started to say water. There are countless stories like this. No matter who I've spoken to or where they come from, the story is so universal and relatable that we were able to embrace culture through TV, through music, through these mediums of understanding this new culture we were existing in, but then also having a sense of reverent appreciation the way we all intend to do when we travel. In describing identity through TV and mediums of culture, Barack writes, TV, movies, the radio. Those were the places to start. Pop culture was color-coded after all, an arcade of images from which we could cop a walk, a talk, a step, or a style. I couldn't croon like Marvin Gaye, but I could learn to dance all of the Soul Train steps. I couldn't pack a gun like Shaft or Superfly, but I could sure enough curse like Richard Pryor. The museum of pop culture that helps form Barack's identity is so fascinating to me because, in a way, I think that's what I'm doing now with this. Through these books and films and art and music, I too am trying to form and develop my identity at this stage in life, in this province of life. But I'm trying to do so in ways that are a lot more intentional in reverence to the autonomy that I have with the free will of being an adult now. I'm new to my freedom, but I'm also wanting to stay close to the responsibility that this foundation that I'm cultivating, that it can be good as long as I remain responsible and attuned to alignment. Through pop culture and these examples that Barack has shared, we see him develop the majority of his character, though, on the basketball court. He writes in chapter 4, "By the time I reached high school, I was playing on teams and could take my game to the university courts where a handful of black men, mostly gym rats and has-beens, would teach me an attitude that didn't just have to do with the sport. That respect came from what you did and not who your daddy was. That you could talk stuff to rattle an opponent. That you should shut the hell up if you can't back it up. That you don't let anyone sneak up behind you to see emotion, like hurt or fear. And something else too. Something nobody talked about. A way of being together when the game was tight and the sweat broke and the best players stopped worrying about their points. And the worst players got swept up in the moment. And the score only mattered because that's how you sustained the trance. If you needed a reason to love basketball, there it is." It resonates when he continues with, "I was living out a caricature of black male adolescence, itself a caricature of swaggering American manhood, yet at a time when boys aren't supposed to want to follow their father's tired footsteps, when the imperatives of harvest or work in the factory aren't supposed to dictate identity. The principal difference between me and most of the man boys around me, the surfers, the football players, the would-be rock and roll guitarists, resided in the limited number of options at my disposal. Each of us chose a costume, armor against uncertainty. At least on the basketball court, I could find a community of sorts, with an inner life all its own. It was there that I would make my closest white friends, on turf where blackness couldn't be a disadvantage. And it was there that I would meet Ray and the others close to my age, who had begun to trickle into the islands. Teenagers whose confusion and anger would help shape my own." Against the backdrop of adolescence and identity formation, Barack brings the bubbling undercurrent of racism to the forefront for us. It's not in a confronting way or the ways that make topics such as these difficult for us to talk about with each other. It's in his way of being matter-of-fact and universal in the dialogue. I was surprised that he had a little cussing in him, you know? He had a little thug in him. But he writes about a few instances like this with the tennis pro who told me during a tournament that I shouldn't touch the schedule of matches pinned up on the bulletin board because my color might rub off. His thin-lipped, red-faced smile, "Can't you take a joke?" when I threatened to report him. He describes another instance on the same page. Assistant basketball coach, a young, wiry man from New York with a nice jumper who, after a pickup game with some talkative black men, had muttered within earshot of me and 3 of my teammates that we shouldn't have lost to a bunch of, with a hard R, and who, when I told him, with a fury that surprised even me, to shut up, had calmly explained the apparently obvious fact that there were black people, and there were. Those guys were. I found this fascinating, that fury that surprises him, that bubbles up, is only something that can happen in the moment. No one ever prepares for racism in the context of that reaction that is innate and humane to being punctured. It's not to begin commiserating about racist or racial experiences, but rather it is to identify those parts in ourselves that are human. What is our reaction and why? I can't ask the same question of those who say these terms because it doesn't make sense. I've experienced more racism in these last 2 years than I have in the majority of the years I've lived in Canada. And yes, I think a lot of that has to do with socioeconomic position change. But I'm fascinated that all these years later, that's something that we have had such exposure to for generations and decades and all this time, that it is still an impulse that people choose. Now, I'm getting better at bracing myself when I hear that same word with the hard R yelled at me outside of trucks, exhaust blowing in my face. But I'm trying to figure out a way that I can exercise my resistance with levity and sweetness. And so I would love to hear from you guys ways that you are able to find levity and sweetness as your own form of resistance. Chapter 4 on page 48. It reads, I was different, after all. Potentially suspect. I had no idea who my own self was. Unwilling to risk exposure, I would quickly retreat to safer ground. Perhaps if we'd been living in New York or LA, I would have been quicker to pick up the rules of the high-stakes game we were all playing. As it was, I learned to slip back and forth between my black and white worlds, understanding that each possessed its own language and customs and structures of meaning. Convinced that with a bit of translation on my part, the two worlds would eventually cohere. There was a trick there somewhere. Although what the trick was, who was doing the tricking, and who was being tricked, eluded my conscious grasp. The way chapter 4 ends is in a way that I admire so much about Barack Obama. It is this way of existing in the tension without needing to back away from it. This tiff between his grandparents is so beautifully human in the way he writes about it. The vulnerability of his gramps when Barack has refereed between the two and they've gone to their separate corners and he's mediating in between. Barack takes us to this intimacy that he has found with a friend of Gramps named Frank. We get to see the different people in our lives that fill these voids without us having to say, can you fill this void of my father? We get to see Barack's grappling with his identity and the unawareness of Gramps because of his lived experience that he couldn't help just being born into that body. And Frank kind of bringing it all together with his wisdom of age. Funny cat, your grandpa, he said. You know, we grew up maybe 50 miles apart, and this is Frank talking. I shook my head. We sure did. Both of us lived near Wichita. We didn't know each other, of course. I was long gone by the time he was old enough to remember anything. I might have seen some of his people, though. Might have passed him on the street. If I did, I would have had to step off the sidewalk to give him room. Your grandpa ever tell you about things like that? I threw the whiskey down my throat, shaking my head again. Nah, Frank said. I don't suppose he would have. Stan doesn't like to talk about that part of Kansas much. Makes him uncomfortable. He told me once about a black girl they hired to look after your mother. A preacher's daughter. Told me how she'd become a regular part of the family. That's how he remembers it. You understand? This girl coming in to look after somebody else's children, her mother coming to do somebody else's laundry. A regular part of the family. I reached for the bottle, this time pouring my own. Frank wasn't watching me. His eyes were closed now. His head leaned against the back of his chair, his big wrinkled face like a carving of stone. You can't blame Stan for what he is, Frank said quietly. He's basically a good man. But he doesn't know me. Any more than he knew that girl that looked after your mother. He can't know me. Not the way that I know him. Maybe some of these Hawaiians can, or the Indians on the reservation. They've seen their fathers humiliated, their mothers desecrated. But your grandfather will never know what that feels like. That's why he can come over here and drink my whiskey and fall asleep in that chair that you're sitting in right now. See, that's something I can never do in his house. Never. Doesn't matter how tired I get, I still have to watch myself. I have to be vigilant for my own survival. And that's it, y'all. That's the introduction in chapters 1 through 4. I hope you'll join me throughout July as we explore the rest of this book, but thank you for joining me today. I hope that this has been helpful for you in some way or resonant. As always, I would love to hear from you. What questions are you asking? Are you having dialogue with someone else about the book? If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe and follow wherever you listen to podcasts and connect with others online. I draw from sweetness beyond the book. And in this week's episode, I'm grateful to have drawn from sources outside of Barack Obama. But first, I wanted to give a shout out to his podcast with Bruce Springsteen. Yes, Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen have a podcast together, and it's called Renegades. I found it to be a surprisingly sweet listen. It's these two old dudes sitting together having conversation in the same ways that I imagine Gramps and Toots and Barack's parents were having these conversations back in the day. It's endearing in some parts where they dedicate 2 episodes to the topic of fatherhood in the context of being fathers now and in the context of having been the children of their respective fathers. It's beautiful, and it's this window into what has made them the fathers that they are today. And I'll make sure to link it. But I wanted to focus on episode 6 of the Renegades podcast. At one point in time, Barack talks about how in writing this book, it was because he realized that if he was going to understand himself better, he needed to understand that man, meaning his father. I wouldn't have thought that someone like Bruce and Barack, with such different lived experience, could relate on almost every topic that they explore, but it reminded me of the point of this podcast. Bruce and Barack talk about their fathers as ghosts and then eventually as ancestors. Bruce says, ghosts haunt you, but ancestors, they walk alongside you. They both seem to agree that a ghost can only become an ancestor if we are willing to approach that void, to sit with it, and to reflect and explore it with reverence. Because eventually they both talk about how ghosts are these scary and tumultuous things. But with ancestors are guides. They usher us forward. They are peaceful. In light of the World Cup happening, something that struck me was this one small interview, and I'll make sure I post it on socials. But I was watching 2 journalists talk about Cristiano Ronaldo seemingly mouthing the words, Bismillah. One journalist asking in curiosity where that's coming from. Cristiano Ronaldo says this word, Bismillah, right before he kicks the successful penalty. And as he says this word, the journalist describes that you say it before you embark on something that you want to bring God along with you. I loved his description, and I loved how the other journalist was so receptive to learning this new word, and how she even ends with, well, I might say a little Bismillah. Excuse my accent, but I found it so endearing and so human. I also admire the ways that in the context of soccer that we are able to accept this and embrace this. Even in the comments, people weren't arguing about religion or our differences. They were all just really excited that Cristiano Ronaldo had been successful, moving on from soccer to a different part of the world. I was struck by a video I saw of a young man describing his experience leaving South Africa as a Nigerian. I won't go into the nature of this story. This just isn't the format, but I invite you to do your own research, to read up about what is happening right now in South Africa. This young man abruptly abandoning and leaving everything he's worked for over so many years. But as he is documenting each stage of getting documentation, getting on buses, being transported, and eventually landing safely in Nigeria. What struck me was how grateful he was. His gratitude struck me in one particular moment. He's on the plane and he is leaving everything that I assume he has worked for over a number of years. His accent is indicative of someone having been in South Africa for more than a little while. But as he's on this plane ride, he's not sad or wallowing or in despair. Instead, he is so grateful to witness the sunrise. How many of us are able to do that in a moment of such chaos and uncertainty? Even now, I think I'm so much more emotional than he was in that video. But it was beautiful to contrast his video alongside all of the news that this person could have such gratitude in spite of. I'm hopeful that you will find this video wherever I repost it on socials. And it's not that we should be grateful for awful things happening to us, but I think what he reminds me of is in the midst of how to stay close to that sweetness and that gratitude. Again, I invite you to subscribe, to follow along, to rate and review. Thank you so much for tuning in, and with the most grateful heart, see you soon, sweetness.